When you read a book, your eyes move across the page, your brain decodes the words, and your mouth stays closed. Every book you have read in the last 10 years, every article, every email, every medication label, every set of instructions from your physician you read in silence. Your voice was off. Your lips did not move. Your throat did not engage. Your ears received nothing from the page. Your brain processed every one of those words through a single channel visual, one channel out of 3 available. The motor system that produces speech over 100 muscles in your diaphragm, your throat, your tongue, your lips, and your jaw was dormant for every page you read silently. The auditory system that would have processed your own voice speaking, those words running a comprehension check, encoding the sound, creating a second memory trace was dark. 2 entire processing systems sat idle while your eyes did all the work alone, and you never noticed what was missing because silent reading feels complete. It feels like you are getting everything from the page. You are not. You are getting the words. You are missing the motor encoding, the auditory reinforcement, and the comprehension check that your voice provides when it speaks what your eyes are reading. MacLeod and colleagues measured what the silence costs. Words read aloud are remembered 15 to 20% better than words. Read silently tested immediately, tested after a delay, tested across every age group examined. They called it the production effect. The advantage is not about volume or attention or effort. The advantage is architectural. Reading aloud forces your brain to process text through 3 systems simultaneously instead of 1. 3 memory traces instead of 1. 3 retrieval pathways instead of 1. The same words. The same meaning. Triple the encoding. Think about what actually fires in your brain when you read a sentence aloud, because the difference between silent reading and spoken reading is not a matter of degree. It is a difference in how much of your cortex participates. Reading silently activates 2 regions: the part of your brain that decodes written language, converting the shapes of letters into words and sentences, and the part that comprehends what those words mean. 2 regions. 1 pathway, eyes to meaning. That is the complete circuit. Everything else is quiet. Speaking the words activates those 2 regions plus an entire additional architecture. The speech planning region must sequence the motor commands for every syllable before you speak it. Your motor cortex must send those commands to over 100 muscles: the diaphragm for breath support, the muscles of your voice box for pitch and phonation, 8 separate muscles in your tongue for consonant and vowel shaping, the muscles around your lips for sounds that require lip closure or rounding, the soft palate for routing air through your nose or your mouth, and your jaw for controlling how wide your mouth opens on each vowel. This coordination runs at approximately 14 phonemes per second in normal adult speech, one of the fastest and most complex motor sequences your body produces. Faster than your fingers on a keyboard, faster than your legs running, faster than any athletic movement you perform. Your hearing system processes the result. Your brain treats your own voice as incoming speech and runs it through the full comprehension pipeline a second time. You are simultaneously the speaker and the listener, and your voice reaches your ears through 2 separate routes that no other voice uses: through the air like any sound, and through the bones of your skull directly to your inner ear. The bone route transmits lower frequencies more efficiently, which is why your voice sounds deeper and more resonant to you than it does to anyone else listening. You know this experience. You have heard a recording of your own voice and thought it sounded thinner, higher, less substantial than the voice you hear inside your head. The recording is what everyone else hears: air conduction only. The voice you hear when you speak is air conduction plus bone conduction. A richer signal, a deeper sound, a version of your voice that only you will ever hear. Your brain receives this richer version and processes it with greater engagement than it processes any other voice: more low-frequency content, faster arrival time through the bone pathway, and simultaneous bilateral input because bone conduction reaches both ears equally through the skull. When you read aloud, your brain is processing your own speech through the richest auditory signal available to it, a signal no other voice can provide, arriving through a pathway no other voice can access. The self-voice advantage is not psychological. It is acoustic. Your own voice is objectively a richer signal to your brain than anyone else's voice. Difference in cortical territory is not marginal. Reading aloud activates substantially more brain area than silent reading. The motor, auditory, and proprioceptive systems all engage alongside the visual system that silent reading uses alone. And each engaged system creates its own independent memory trace of the content: visual, motor, and auditory encoding, running in parallel, each producing a separate record that your memory system can later use to retrieve the information. Now, a question the production effect raises but does not answer on its own, because the 15 to 20% memory advantage is the measurable outcome. The mechanism underneath it, why triple encoding produces better memory, reveals something about how your memory system works that changes how you think about every piece of information you want to retain. Your memory retrieves based on distinctiveness. When you try to remember something, the name of a medication, the details of a financial document, the instructions your physician gave you, your retrieval system searches through stored memories for the one that matches your search. Memories encoded through a single channel visual only are stored alongside millions of other visually encoded memories. They are not distinctive, they blend. The medication name you read silently last Tuesday is stored in an identical format, through an identical pathway, using an identical encoding method as every other word you read silently last Tuesday. The retrieval system cannot easily distinguish it from the background. A word you read aloud is stored differently. The memory includes what your eyes saw, the visual trace. It includes what your mouth did, how your tongue moved on the consonants, how your lips shaped the vowels, how your breath supported the syllables. And it includes what your ears heard, the sound of the word in your own voice, at the pitch and rhythm and emphasis you chose when you spoke it. 3 traces. 3 retrieval cues. When you search for that memory, any one of the 3 cues can locate it, and the visual appearance of the word on the page, the motor feel of producing it in your mouth, or the auditory sound of hearing it in your own voice. The probability of successful retrieval increases with each additional encoding pathway. The memory is not stronger because you tried harder. It is stronger because it is stored in 3 places instead of 1, and your retrieval system only needs to find one of the 3 to bring the entire memory back. You see, and this is where the practical consequence becomes personal. Because if you are over 45 and you read a prescription label silently, put the bottle down, and cannot remember the dosage an hour later, you are not experiencing early cognitive decline. You are experiencing single-channel encoding retrieving poorly against a background of millions of other single-channel memories. The label looked like every other label. The visual trace is not distinctive enough to locate. The same label read aloud, spoken, heard, felt in the mouth, produces a trace distinctive enough to find an hour later, a day later, a week later. The improvement is not about concentration. It is not about reading more carefully. It is about giving your memory system 3 ways to find the information instead of 1. The financial document you read silently and cannot recall the key numbers from. The email from your physician's office with appointment instructions you had to reread because the details did not stick. The recipe you read 3 times because the measurements kept slipping. Each of these is a single-channel encoding problem, visual-only storage producing memories that are indistinguishable from the thousands of other visual-only memories your brain created that week. Reading any of them aloud once, at normal speed, in your normal voice would have tripled the encoding without adding a second of extra reading time. The time is identical. The voice is the only variable. The memory improvement is architectural. And here is where a second question opens, because the production effect explains why reading aloud improves memory. It does not explain why reading aloud feels different from speaking in conversation. Why does reading a book aloud to an empty room produce a cognitive effect that chatting with a friend does not? Both involve speech. Both activate the motor system. Both produce auditory feedback. The difference is in what you are speaking, and the difference matters for every circuit involved. Conversational speech uses a limited vocabulary. You speak in short sentences. You repeat familiar phrases. You use the words you already know well, the words whose motor programs are so rehearsed that your mouth produces them without effort. The speech planning region barely engages because the motor sequences are automated. The cognitive demand is low. The circuits are maintained at a baseline level, but they are not challenged. Reading aloud forces your mouth to produce words your conversational vocabulary does not include. Written text, even a newspaper, even a novel, even a recipe, uses vocabulary that is measurably richer and syntactically more complex than spoken conversation. The speech planning region must sequence motor commands for unfamiliar words, words your mouth has not recently shaped, consonant clusters your tongue has not recently navigated, multi-syllable sequences your respiratory timing has not recently managed. The motor cortex is working harder. The speech planning region is working harder. The timing coordination is working harder. Every circuit involved in speech production is operating at the complexity level of the written text rather than the complexity level of your habitual conversation. Difference matters for maintenance. The circuits that produce speech, the motor pathways, the planning regions, the timing coordination, maintain their processing speed and their synaptic connections through regular use at sufficient complexity. Conversational speech maintains them at conversational complexity. Reading aloud maintains them at the complexity of whatever you are reading. If you read Virginia Woolf aloud, you are running their speech production circuits through syntactic structures and vocabulary demands that no conversation would impose. The circuits are not just active, they are challenged. And challenged circuits maintain better than coasting circuits. The neuroscience of use-dependent maintenance is consistent on this point. Think about what happens to your breathing when you read aloud, because the respiratory dimension of reading aloud is something no one mentions and everyone experiences. Reading silently imposes no respiratory demands. Your breathing continues at its resting pattern, 12 to 20 breaths per minute, uncoordinated with the text, unrelated to the sentence structure, autonomous and unmonitored. Reading aloud forces your respiratory system to subordinate to the text. You must take a breath at the right moment, at a clause boundary, at a period, at a natural pause in the sentence structure. Your diaphragm must supply enough air to carry the phrase to its end. If the sentence is long, your breath must be deeper. If the sentence contains a parenthetical clause, a subordinate thought embedded in the middle of a longer thought, your respiratory system must budget the air supply across the full structure, holding enough in reserve to finish the main clause after the interruption. This is respiratory-linguistic coupling, your breathing subordinated to the syntactic structure of written text. The coupling imposes a breathing pattern that is slower, deeper, and more rhythmic than resting respiration, because written sentences are longer and more structured than conversational utterances. The breathing you settle into during sustained reading aloud, deeper breaths at clause boundaries, longer exhales across multi-clause sentences, a rhythm dictated by the punctuation on the page, falls in a range associated with optimal autonomic balance. The handwork discussion described a motor activity imposing a respiratory rhythm that shifts autonomic tone toward calm. Reading aloud does it through the speech motor system rather than through the hand motor system, but the downstream effect, breathing rate influencing vagal tone influencing heart rate variability, operates through identical brainstem circuits. You will notice this if you read aloud for 5 minutes and then stop. The breathing pattern does not immediately revert. Your respiratory system has been entrained by the syntactic structure of the text for 5 minutes, and the entrainment persists briefly after you stop, the way a song continues in your head after the music stops. The calm that follows 5 minutes of reading aloud is partly respiratory, a breathing pattern imposed by sentence structure that outlasts the reading itself. Well, and the comprehension dimension, because reading aloud does not just encode better and maintain circuits better, it comprehends better, and the mechanism is a feedback loop that silent reading cannot produce. When you read aloud and your voice produces a sentence, your auditory system processes that sentence as incoming speech, running the full comprehension pipeline on your own output. You are simultaneously the speaker and the listener. Your comprehension is tested twice, once when your visual system decoded the text, and once when your auditory system processed your spoken version of it. If something is wrong, if you misread a word, if the sentence structure does not pass correctly, if the meaning is ambiguous, your auditory system catches the error and flags it for correction. You have experienced this. You were reading aloud, and you stopped mid-sentence because something did not sound right. You went back, you reread. The sentence that your eyes had passed over without difficulty, the sentence that silent reading would have let you skim past, snagged in your ears when you spoke it. The auditory system caught what the visual system missed. The mispronunciation that revealed a misreading. The clause structure that collapsed when spoken. The word your eyes interpreted one way but your voice revealed as another. The auditory feedback loop is a real-time comprehension check that silent reading does not perform, and the check catches errors at a rate that visual-only processing cannot match. That loop, your ears checking your eyes, your voice testing your comprehension, the error surfacing as a stumble that silent reading would have buried, is the quality control mechanism that ended my trust in visual-only reading for anything that matters. Prosodic dimension deepens this further. When you read silently, the words arrive without rhythm, without pitch variation, without emphasis. The sentence, "She didn't steal the money," has 7 different meanings depending on which word you stress, and silent reading delivers none of those stress patterns. Your visual system decodes the words. Your comprehension system assigns a default meaning. The ambiguity passes unexamined. You may have understood the sentence. You may have misunderstood it. Silent reading cannot tell you which, because silent reading does not require you to commit to an interpretation. Speaking the words forces you to choose. You must decide which word to stress, where to pause, how to modulate your pitch across the sentence. Each decision requires a level of comprehension that silent reading does not demand. You must understand the meaning well enough to perform it. The performance is the comprehension test. If you cannot find the right stress pattern for a sentence, you have not fully understood the sentence, and reading aloud makes that gap audible in a way that silent reading never reveals. Prosodic processing also engages the opposite side of your brain from language decoding. Language, the words, the grammar, the literal meaning is processed predominantly on the left side. Prosody, the melody, the rhythm, the emotional contour of speech is processed predominantly on the right. Silent reading is largely a left side activity. Reading aloud is bilateral. The left side decodes the language. The right side processes the prosody you perform. Both hemispheres active, both contributing to comprehension. The full engagement produces a more complete cognitive processing of the text than either side working alone, and the right hemisphere engagement is exclusively available through reading aloud. Silent reading does not activate it because silent reading produces no prosody for the right hemisphere to process. And then the question for anyone over 45. Because the word finding difficulty, the tip of the tongue moments, the sense that verbal fluency is not what it was at 35. These are the symptoms that bring people to their physicians worried about cognitive decline. And the question worth asking before the worry takes hold is whether the decline is in the brain or in the input the brain has been receiving. Circuits that produce speech maintain themselves through use at sufficient complexity. Every circuit in your brain operates on a use it or maintain it principle. Connections that fire regularly remain strong. Connections that go unused weaken and eventually prune. The speech production circuits, the planning region, the motor pathways, the timing coordination between breath and voice and tongue require regular activation at sufficient complexity to maintain their processing speed and their connection density. Consider what your typical day provides. You read silently, the speech circuits are dormant. You watch television, the speech circuits are dormant. You scroll through your phone, the speech circuits are dormant. You listen to podcasts, the comprehension circuits are active, but the production circuits are dormant. You send text messages, the language circuits are active, but the motor speech circuits are dormant. The only activation your speech production system receives in a typical modern day is conversation, and conversation operates at reduced complexity with automated vocabulary and short, familiar sentence structures. The circuits that produce complex speech, the circuits that sequence unfamiliar words, that navigate subordinate clauses, that coordinate respiratory timing across long sentences receive almost no activation. If you were an articulate speaker at 40 and you notice word finding difficulty at 55, your brain may not be declining. Your speech production circuits may be understimulated, maintained at conversational complexity when they require literary complexity to stay sharp. The tip of the tongue moment may be a retrieval failure in a circuit that has not been exercised at the complexity level the retrieval demands. The word is there. The pathway to it may have thinned from disuse rather than degraded from age. The circuit needs input at sufficient complexity to maintain the connections that rapid retrieval requires, and conversation alone does not provide that complexity. 5 minutes of reading aloud daily changes the input entirely. Your motor system coordinates 100 muscles at 14 phonemes per second, sequencing unfamiliar words, navigating consonant clusters, managing respiratory timing across complex sentences that conversational speech never demands. Your hearing system processes your voice through air and bone simultaneously, running a second comprehension check on every sentence. Your memory system encodes through 3 channels instead of 1. Your respiratory system subordinates to syntactic structure, producing a breathing pattern that shifts autonomic tone toward calm. 5 minutes. The words that will be there when you need them in conversation next week are there because you spoke them aloud from a page this morning. 5 minutes. Any text. Any room. The room can be empty. The circuits do not know whether anyone is listening. They fire identically whether you are reading to a grandchild, to a partner, or to a kitchen wall. The audience is irrelevant to the mechanism. The mechanism requires your voice, your ears, and your eyes operating on text simultaneously, nothing else. If you have not read aloud in years, and most adults have not, outside of reading to children, the first minute will feel strange. Your voice will sound unfamiliar to you in the context of a book. You may stumble on words that your eyes would have glided over, silently long words, technical words, words with consonant clusters that your mouth has not produced in months. The stumbling is not a problem. The stumbling is the mechanism working. Each stumble is a word whose motor program has weakened from disuse, a pathway your mouth once navigated fluently that has thinned because nothing in your daily life asks your voice to produce it. Reading it aloud is the activation that pathway needs. By the 3rd or 4th day, the stumbles decrease. The motor programs are reactivating. The words your mouth could not find on day 1 come smoothly by day 5, not because you practiced them deliberately, but because the circuits fired and the connections strengthened through use. By the 2nd week, you will notice something else. Your voice has changed. Not dramatically, but the fluency, the rhythm, the confidence of your spoken production will be slightly different from what it was before you started. The circuits that produce speech are operating at higher capacity. The word finding is fractionally faster. The sentences come more easily. The reading aloud is not just encoding text better. It is maintaining the speech production system at a complexity level that your conversational life does not provide. That architectural difference, 3 processing systems active during reading aloud versus 1 during silent reading, triple encoding versus single encoding, bilateral cortical engagement versus predominantly one-sided processing, motor auditory feedback loops versus passive visual decoding, is the finding that made every silent reading session carry an invisible cost for me. The cost was never visible because silent reading feels complete. It feels like you are getting everything the text offers. You are getting the words. You are missing 2/3 of the processing your brain would perform if your voice were involved. Silent reading was invented roughly 1500 years ago. Before that, nearly all reading was aloud. Texts were predominantly spoken, libraries were noisy, readers were speakers. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th century, described watching Ambrose of Milan read silently and recorded it as remarkable, so unusual that it warranted documentation. The act of reading without moving your lips was strange enough to write about. For the previous 3,000 years of written language, from Sumerian cuneiform through Greek scrolls through Roman texts, reading meant speaking. The library at Alexandria was not quiet. It was a hall of voices. Every scholar reading simultaneously, every text spoken aloud, the comprehension check, and the motor encoding, and the respiratory coupling operating continuously in every reader in the building. The shift to silent reading was a convenience, faster, quieter, socially easier. You could read in bed without disturbing a partner. You could read in a crowded room without competing with other voices. You could read faster because your eyes could move ahead of what your mouth could produce. The convenience was real. The cost was invisible because the cost was not in what silent reading added but in what it subtracted. Triple encoding reduced to single. The auditory feedback loop switched off. The respiratory-linguistic coupling abandoned. The bilateral hemisphere engagement reduced to predominantly one side. The cost accumulated across decades of silent reading, and the word finding that gets harder, the memory that gets shorter, the verbal fluency that thins may not be aging alone. Some of it may be the circuits that reading aloud would have maintained going quiet because nothing in the modern day asks them to fire. The convenience was 1,500 years old before anyone measured what it cost. MacLeod measured part of it, 15 to 20% of memory encoding, lost. The motor maintenance cost, the comprehension cost, the respiratory cost, The prosodic cost, those are still being measured. The direction is consistent. Silent reading is faster. Reading aloud is deeper. The depth is what the circuits need. 5 minutes. Read aloud. To nobody, to a cat, to an empty room. The voice you hear deeper, richer than anyone else hears it, conducted through the bone of your skull and the air of the room simultaneously, is 3 processing systems waking up. That is what silent reading turned off. 5 minutes turns it back on.